When war ignited in September 1939, Europe fell into chaos faster than most had imagined. Germany's blitzkrieg stormed across Poland in just over 4 weeks, shocking observers with its speed, coordination, and ruthless efficiency. The world watched the Wehrmacht move with an almost mechanical precision. Armor, infantry, and air power combined in a manner unseen in modern warfare. The message was clear. Germany had mastered the future of war. In Washington, few were listening. The United States, still wounded by the Great Depression and haunted by the memory of the First World War, clung to isolation. The Neutrality Acts forbade arms shipments. Newspapers debated Europe's fate as if it were another planet. The idea that American soldiers would again cross the Atlantic seemed unthinkable. But far from Berlin's confidence, something subtle began to shift. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that geography no longer meant safety. He quietly expanded the Navy, pushed for the Lend-Lease program, and turned America's industrial heartland toward war production. By 1941, the assembly lines of Detroit and Pittsburgh were producing tanks and aircraft at an accelerating pace, still for Britain and the Soviets, not yet for themselves. In the German High Command, these moves were noted but dismissed. Intelligence reports described American soldiers as inexperienced, undisciplined, and technologically inferior. General Franz Halder's diary from late 1940 captured the sentiment. The Americans have material, not soldiers. Many believed that if the United States ever joined the war, its contribution would be limited to supplies and bombers, never men storming beaches under fire. Then came December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor changed everything. In a single morning, isolation vanished. The nation that Germany had mocked as soft awoke with industrial fury. Shipyards roared to life. Men lined up at recruiting offices. Women filled the factories. The American war machine, sprawling, decentralized, and immense, began to move. Within a year, its scale would eclipse anything Germany could have imagined. Yet across occupied Europe, German officers still clung to a dangerous illusion. They had fought the British in North Africa, battled the Soviets across the Eastern Front, and endured the grinding attrition of total war. To them, the Americans were newcomers, untested, perhaps brave, but strategically naive. Reports from Tunisia in early 1943 seemed to confirm it. At Kasserine Pass, inexperienced U.S. divisions faltered under the seasoned attacks of Rommel's Afrika Korps. German officers wrote that the Americans lacked tactical instinct and fought with textbook rigidity. For Berlin, Kasserine was proof that the myth of American weakness was real. For Washington, it was a lesson paid for in blood. What followed was transformation. Under General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the U.S. Army began to evolve with remarkable speed. Command structures were refined, logistics lines hardened, and tactics rewritten. By the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, the Americans were no longer novices. They were learning faster than any opponent expected. Within months, they were fighting alongside British forces with growing confidence, driving the Axis out of North Africa and into retreat across the Mediterranean. Behind the front lines, American industry became a weapon in itself. Factories operated day and night, producing bombers, tanks, landing craft, and ammunition in quantities beyond imagination. By 1944, the United States was building nearly 100,000 aircraft a year and outproducing all Axis powers combined. Every shell, every engine, every crate of supplies crossed an ocean sustained by convoys that defied U-boat terror. And yet the Germans still underestimated what was coming. Their Atlantic Wall, a line of concrete bunkers, gun emplacements, and barbed wire stretching along the coast of France, was designed to repel any invasion. They believed that even if the Allies attempted a landing, it would fail within days. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, one of the few who understood the scale of Allied production, warned his superiors, "The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. For the Allies as well as Germany, it will be the longest day." He was right, but in early 1944, even Rommel did not fully comprehend what the Americans were assembling. A logistical network spanning continents, a fleet so vast it would darken the sea, an army transported across an ocean by industrial will, alone. The arrogance that began in that smoke-filled Berlin room in 1941 still lingered, a belief that the United States could never truly wage war on the scale of Europe's empires, that belief would soon meet the surf at Normandy. By the start of 1944, Germany was still holding vast territories across Europe, but beneath the surface, the foundations were cracking. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army was pushing west with relentless momentum. In Italy, Allied troops had already breached Mussolini's defenses, and in the west a quiet storm was gathering. Across the English Channel, an armada that existed more in rumor than in German intelligence reports. At the heart of that storm stood Operation Overlord. The Allied plan to invade northern France. It was the most complex military operation ever conceived, involving over 150,000 troops on the first day alone, supported by 7,000 ships and 11,000 aircraft. Planning began in earnest in 1943, with Eisenhower appointed supreme commander. His task was monumental: to bring together American, British, and Canadian forces, each with different doctrines, equipment, and leadership cultures, and forge them into a single, coordinated invasion army. While Allied staff built logistics on a scale the world had never seen, Germany was blinded by its own assumptions. Hitler's high command believed that no nation, not even the industrial giant across the Atlantic, could organize such a feat in time. The German 15th Army waited near Calais, convinced that if the Allies landed anywhere, it would be there, the narrowest point between Britain and France. The deception plan known as Operation Fortitude exploited that belief perfectly. Through double agents, fake radio traffic, and inflatable tanks scattered across southern England, the Allies created the illusion of an army led by General George S. Patton, preparing to strike Calais. Even German aerial reconnaissance, limited by Allied air superiority, failed to detect the ruse. Every false clue confirmed what Berlin already believed: that the Americans preferred the obvious, direct approach. Meanwhile, across the quiet English countryside, the real invasion force was taking shape. In ports from Plymouth to Portsmouth, entire cities of men and machines assembled in secrecy. Factories in the U.S. poured out landing craft at astonishing rates: Higgins boats, LSTs, and specialized armored vehicles designed for amphibious assault. Each one was numbered, catalogued, and loaded with precision. By May 1944, the logistical buildup known as Operation Bolero had placed more than 2 million Allied soldiers in Britain, an entire continent in waiting. The German generals monitoring these developments were uneasy, but their intelligence network in the Abwehr was crippled. Nearly every agent they sent to Britain had been captured and turned. The information reaching Berlin was exactly what the Allies wanted them to believe. Even Rommel, charged with defending the Atlantic Wall, could not persuade his superiors of the danger. He saw the troop concentrations across the Channel, the constant bombing of transport routes, the relentless air activity. He sensed what was coming, but Hitler refused to release armored reserves without his personal approval, fearing a feint. In early June 1944, storm clouds rolled across the Channel. The weather turned violent, grounding aircraft and delaying ships. German meteorologists predicted no invasion was possible for at least a week. Confident in their forecast, many German officers left their posts. Rommel himself traveled to Germany for his wife's birthday. Then, on the night of June 5th, under cover of darkness, the greatest armada in human history began to move. Over 5,000 ships stretched from horizon to horizon, carrying men, tanks, and supplies toward Normandy's beaches. Overhead, thousands of aircraft filled the sky. Transport planes, gliders, bombers, and fighters, all synchronized in one massive, living machine. At bar 0:16 hours, British glider troops landed near Pegasus Bridge, securing vital crossings. At 02:30, American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropped behind enemy lines, their silhouettes scattering across the night sky. By dawn, the German defenders finally understood. The invasion they had dismissed as impossible was underway, not at Calais but on the shores of Normandy. The first reports reaching Berlin were chaotic. Coastal radar screens showed ghost fleets. Communications were jammed. Field commanders begged for reinforcements, but Hitler, still convinced this was a diversion, withheld the panzer divisions. For hours, the Germans waited for confirmation that never came. And as the sun rose over the French coast on June 6, 1944, the myth of American weakness began to burn away. What followed would rewrite the history of modern warfare, a confrontation not just of armies, but of industrial might, human endurance, and the cost of arrogance. In the gray light before dawn, the men in the landing craft could barely see one another. The air was thick with diesel and sea spray. The water slapped against steel hulls as engines droned toward the invisible shore. Among them were farm boys from Kansas, machinists from Chicago, clerks from Boston, ordinary Americans who had never seen Europe until this moment. Many were seasick. Many prayed. None spoke much. The only sound was the hiss of water and the clatter of gear. They knew the Germans were waiting, hidden behind concrete and wire. When the ramps dropped at Omaha Beach, machine gun fire cut through the mist like tearing metal. Men fell before they could take a step. Others crawled forward, clinging to the sand, using the bodies of fallen friends as cover. Officers shouted orders drowned by the roar of artillery. Yet through chaos they moved, inch by inch, wave by wave. It was not courage born of heroism, but of survival and duty. The same men once dismissed as factory workers were now storming the most heavily defended coastline in the world. The human face of the invasion was fear, and persistence against it. By nightfall, thousands lay dead or wounded, but the beach was held. America, once mocked as weak, had bled its way into Europe. The German army had perfected defense through discipline and doctrine. Every approach, every elevation, every field of fire was calculated. But what they could not calculate was adaptability. The American army that landed on D-Day was no longer the same force that had faltered at Kasserine. In the years between, it had learned to combine armor, infantry, and airpower with lethal coordination. On the beaches, small unit leaders made split-second decisions without waiting for orders from above, a radical break from older doctrines. Sergeants directed tank support through hand signals. Engineers used Bangalore torpedoes to blast open wire fields. Naval destroyers, risking grounding, closed to within a few hundred meters to fire point-blank at German bunkers. Flexibility replaced rigidity. Initiative replaced hesitation. German defenders later wrote of confusion. "We expected a coordinated attack, not this chaos." But the chaos had direction. It was the new American art of war, improvisation under fire. Every lesson of the past 3 years, every defeat, every hard-won adaptation, now converged on the beaches of Normandy. The tactics forged in failure had evolved into an unstoppable doctrine of momentum. Behind every rifleman on the sand stood an empire of production. The true weapon of the United States in 1944 was not any single gun or tank. It was its factories. In the months before D-Day, America shipped over 20 million tons of supplies to Britain. Every bullet, ration, uniform, and vehicle was logged, packed, and delivered through a logistical network spanning 2 oceans. The Liberty ships, mass-produced cargo vessels, carried this lifeline at a pace that defied German submarines. On average, a new ship was launched every 4 days. The invasion's success depended on precision and abundance. Specialized vehicles, amphibious tanks, self-propelled artillery, bulldozers, were designed not by generals, but by engineers and assembly line workers. It was a victory of organization as much as courage. The Red Ball Express, later launched after the landings, would extend this miracle across Europe, fleets of trucks delivering fuel and ammunition non-stop to advancing armies. To the Germans, it seemed inhuman. They had fought nations before, but never an industry. In Berlin, officers reviewing reports from Normandy were stunned. Every destroyed landing craft seemed instantly replaced. Every shell expended was replenished by nightfall. The scale was beyond anything their doctrine could contain. The invasion was not merely a battle. It was the industrial age at war with itself. And America had mastered its rhythm. By June 7, 1944, the German commanders realized they were not fighting just an army. They were fighting an idea, the union of manpower, technology, and limitless supply. And that realization leads to the next dimension: leadership, enemy perspective, and the moral reckoning that followed. At the heart of Operation Overlord stood a single, quiet figure, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Calm, measured, and deliberate. He carried the weight of 3 nations on his shoulders. Every order he gave would send thousands into fire. Every hesitation could doom the invasion. On the eve of June 6th, as storms battered the channel, his staff debated delay. Eisenhower listened, silent, as meteorologists predicted a narrow break in the weather. If he postponed, the armada would have to disperse. If he advanced, men would die by the thousands. The decision was his alone. He stood by the window of his headquarters, hands behind his back, eyes on the rain. Then he spoke the words that changed history. "Okay, let's go." That calm order set in motion the largest seaborne invasion ever attempted. His leadership was not defined by rhetoric or charisma, but by composure, the ability to bear uncertainty without breaking. Eisenhower later wrote, "If any blame attaches to the decision, it is mine alone." Across from him, German commanders faced paralysis. Rommel's foresight was ignored, Rundstedt's warnings dismissed. While the Allies operated under unified command, Germany's strategy fractured under Hitler's obsession with control. Leadership, one calm and collective, the other erratic and divided, shaped the fate of nations that morning. For the German High Command, the Americans were never supposed to reach Normandy. Their assumptions had been formed by ideology, not intelligence. Nazi propaganda had long portrayed the United States as a land of racial dilution and material greed, incapable of discipline or sacrifice. Even experienced officers hardened by years of combat believed it. After the landings, reports from the front contradicted everything they thought they knew. Field units spoke of relentless artillery barrages, air dominance that turned daylight into danger, and fresh divisions arriving as if from thin air. A diary found on a German officer at St. Lo captured the disbelief. "They have an endless army. We destroy one, another appears." In Berlin, staff officers tried to rationalize the impossible. They blamed the weather, bad intelligence, luck. But deep down, many knew the truth. They had underestimated a nation's capacity for war. The Americans, once dismissed as amateurs, had mastered logistics, strategy, and coordination at a level Germany's strained industry could no longer match. Their strength was not in tradition or aristocratic command, but in efficiency, science, and relentless optimism. By the time Hitler realized this, his armies were already trapped in a storm they could not control. The shock of Normandy was not just military, it was psychological. The myth of German invincibility had finally met its mirror image. D-Day's triumph came at an unbearable cost. By the end of June 6th, over 10,000 Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. The beaches that symbolized liberation were also graveyards. War at this magnitude stripped away illusion. The same industrial power that built tanks and bombers also mechanized death. American soldiers who once assembled cars and tractors now fought inside machines designed to destroy. Factories ran on the labor of women and immigrants, turning assembly lines into arteries of war. It was a moral paradox, victory born from the same machinery that made the modern world. For the Germans, this realization came differently. As the tide of Allied men and metal pushed inland, many defenders began to understand the hopelessness of resistance. Some surrendered in disbelief. Others fought until the end, clinging to orders that no longer mattered. The moral scale of D-Day was not only measured in blood, but in transformation of nations, of conscience, of what humanity could endure when war became industrial. By June's end, the Atlantic Wall was broken, the German illusion shattered, and ahead lay the moment when that shock crystallized, the turning point that would decide the fate of Europe. Itself, June 6, 1944, 5:30 a.m., the first light of dawn crawled across the Normandy coast. The tide rolled in red and white. The foam mingled with blood. Thousands of men lay sprawled along the beaches, rifles half buried in sand, while the roar of engines and artillery filled the morning air. On Omaha, the assault was hanging by a thread. The terrain favored the defenders. Steep cliffs, interlocking machine gun nests, and open ground offering no cover. Every few meters another wave fell. Yet amid the chaos, fragments of leadership emerged. Lieutenants took command of scattered platoons. Medics ran through open fire to pull the wounded back. The plan had collapsed, but the will to advance had not. By 07 a.m., U.S. destroyers, defying orders, closed to within 800 yards of the shore, so close that waves broke against their hulls. Their guns fired directly into the German positions at point-blank range. Each concussion shook the beach like thunder. Under that cover, small units began to push forward. Engineers blasted paths through the wire. Infantry crawled up ravines. Slowly the tide turned. At 08Q, reports from the German 7th Army painted a grim picture. Heavy landings at Omaha, Utah, Juneau, Sword, and Gold. Our communication lines are broken. Enemy strength greater than expected. Rundstedt demanded armored reinforcements, but Hitler, still convinced the real invasion was yet to come at Calais, refused. His personal authorization was required to release panzer reserves, and he was asleep at his headquarters in Berchtesgaden. No one dared wake him. By the time he finally rose and read the reports, it was late morning. Hours had been lost, the most critical hours of the war. When his approval came, Allied fighters already ruled the skies. German columns moving toward Normandy were torn apart by P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons. Roads turned into corridors of fire. On the beaches, the Americans were breaking through. At 10:00 a.m., a group of Rangers scaled the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc, capturing the guns that threatened the western beaches. By noon, the first tanks rolled inland from Omaha and Utah. What had begun as chaos was now coordination, a living machine rebuilding itself under pressure. The Wehrmacht had fought brilliantly, but Germany's industrial heart could no longer sustain its reach. The Allies, through sheer organizational genius and industrial unity, had transformed the war into a test of endurance. And in that test, America's strength had no equal. The very arrogance that began in Berlin's marble halls in 1941 had come full circle, ending in rubble, retreat, and disbelief. The weak America, they mocked, had built the most powerful invasion force the world had ever seen. And behind, every tank, every rifle, and every ship stood a factory worker, a truck driver, an engineer, and a system so vast that even Hitler's entire Reich could not comprehend it. Winter, 1944, the Western Front. The German army was retreating through frozen mud. Their tanks, once symbols of unstoppable blitzkrieg, now sputtered and died on empty fuel lines. Crews abandoned vehicles and trudged through snow, rifles slung across their shoulders, hungry, exhausted, and beaten by an enemy they once mocked. The Allies pressed forward, methodical and unrelenting. Behind them, entire industries moved with them. Portable depots, mobile bakeries, traveling fuel dumps, and endless convoys. The Americans had turned the art of war into a system of motion. Even in winter storms, when aircraft were grounded and roads impassable, the flow of supplies continued. German soldiers who surrendered often spoke in disbelief. They couldn't understand how the Americans kept advancing without pause, without exhaustion. To them it seemed supernatural, but it wasn't. It was the result of an economy mobilized to a level of precision the world had never seen. Hitler's last hopes rested on the Ardennes, a desperate counterattack meant to split the Allied front and force a political negotiation. It was December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge began with surprise and fury. For a few days it seemed as if the German army had rediscovered its old fire. But even there, the same fatal pattern returned. German tanks advanced fast, but ran out of fuel. Their logistical tail could not sustain the momentum. American engineers, truck drivers, and supply officers, the same quiet figures who had powered D-Day, once again made the difference. Within weeks, the German offensive collapsed under its own starvation. By spring 1945, the Red Ball Express had completed its mission. The Allied front was now self-sustaining, stretching from Normandy to the Rhine, then deep into Germany itself. When Patton's troops reached the Elbe River, they had consumed over 10 million gallons of fuel in a single month. And still the trucks kept coming. In the ruins of Berlin, Hitler raged and ranted against the inevitable. He blamed his generals, his people, even the weather, but never his own blindness. The irony was bitter. Years earlier, he had dismissed the United States as a weak industrial nation, incapable of sustaining war. Now his empire lay shattered by that very strength. As the Red Army closed from the east and the Western Allies from the west, the German command structure collapsed entirely. Orders went unanswered. Units disintegrated. Civilians fled westward. In panic, desperate to surrender to the Americans rather than face Soviet vengeance. In April 1945, the Reich Chancellery, the same hall where laughter once mocked the soft Americans, stood in silence, its walls shaking under artillery fire. By May, it was over. Germany had fallen. When the dust settled, historians began to understand the true magnitude of what had occurred. The D-Day invasion and the campaigns that followed were not just feats of courage or strategy. They were the triumph of industrial organization and logistical science. For every soldier who fought on the front line, 10 others worked behind him, building, driving, repairing, calculating. D-Day proved that modern war was no longer just about generals and battles. It was about systems, nations, and willpower measured in steel and fuel. The Germans had invented blitzkrieg, fast, coordinated warfare, but the Americans perfected something even greater: sustained total war. A machine of movement that could not be stopped once set in motion. When the war ended, that same machinery reshaped the modern world. The United States emerged not only as a military victor, but as the industrial heart of a new global order. Its factories now powered reconstruction instead of destruction. The same logistical genius that fed Normandy would later rebuild Europe through the Marshall Plan. And in Germany, veterans of the Wehrmacht reflected in quiet disbelief. The nation that once prided itself on precision engineering had been defeated by an enemy whose strength lay not in pride, but in process. The laughter in Berlin in 1941 had long faded into history. What remained was a single truth carved into the ruins of Europe. America had been underestimated, and that miscalculation had destroyed the Third Reich. The beaches of Normandy had been the beginning of the end, not just of a war, but of an age where arrogance outweighed reality. War, at its heart, is not just a contest of armies. It is a mirror held to civilization itself. The German officers who once laughed at America's softness had measured strength in the wrong way. They saw only muscle and firepower, not the invisible force of organization, cooperation, and collective will. When the Allies landed at Normandy, they brought more than soldiers. They brought the sum of a nation's unity. Every worker at a factory line, every farmer growing food for troops, every engineer who solved a problem no one would ever see. It was that quiet, tireless rhythm that turned an invasion into liberation. The lesson was simple, yet profound. True strength lies not in arrogance, but in endurance. Not in destruction, but in the capacity to build, rebuild, and sustain. For Germany, D-Day was a reckoning. The myth of invincibility that had carried the Reich across Europe was shattered in a single summer. For the United States, it was a revelation, a moment when an industrial democracy proved it could outfight and outlast the most disciplined war machine of its age. And for the world, it was a turning point. The beaches of Normandy became the threshold of a new era, one defined not by empires but by systems, not by conquest, but by cooperation on an unprecedented scale. The arrogance that began in the EI war rooms of Berlin died on those beaches, buried beneath the same sand that now holds silent monuments to courage and sacrifice. If the 20th century taught anything, it is that wars are no longer won by heroes alone, but by the hands of millions who work unseen: the builders, the drivers, the planners, the ordinary men and women who turn chaos into order. And in that, truth lies the quiet poetry of D-Day. The world's most brutal invasion became its greatest act of unity.